The air in the restoration lab was thick with dust and the faint, metallic tang of old paint. Among the forgotten canvases, one portrait had long gone unnoticed, its edges frayed, its colors dimmed to a dull murmur of shadow. When the restorers finally peeled away the years of grime, they expected to find little more than a child's likeness lost to time. Instead, the act of enlarging the image revealed a detail that had never been visible before. In the small hands of the slave child lay an object so delicately carved it seemed almost impossible, yet the shape held a sinister familiarity, like a whisper from a long-dead world. The room grew colder as the restorers leaned closer, their breaths shallow, hearts quickening with a dread they could neither name nor shake. The child's eyes, so alive, so piercing, seemed to follow them across the lab, and a shiver ran down every spine. Something in that portrait was awake, and it had been waiting a very long time. The archive was a place few remembered, tucked behind the main halls of the museum, where sunlight never reached, and the air hung heavy, with the smell of aged paper and varnish. Rows upon rows of shelves loomed like silent sentinels, each one sagging under the weight of forgotten canvases, brittle sketchbooks, and cracked frames. It was the kind of room that invited curiosity and punished haste, where a careless hand could send centuries tumbling to the floor in a storm of dust and splinters. The restorers had been tasked with cataloging items long abandoned, objects that no historian had touched in decades, and it was during one of these slow, meticulous walks that they found the portrait. At first, it seemed insignificant, a small painting leaning against a wall, its frame chipped and warped. The surface was dull, smeared with the kind of grime that only time could produce, and the colors had faded into a palette of muted browns and ochres. There was a stiffness to the child's posture, a solemnity that immediately distinguished it from the cheerful, staged likenesses that filled the gallery upstairs. The eyes, though dulled with age, held a curious intelligence, a sharp awareness that seemed to pierce through the layers of dust and varnish. The restorers moved closer, gloves creaking softly as they lifted the painting from its precarious perch. Each brushstroke had been applied with precision, yet the decades had not been kind. The canvas bore the scars of neglect, with tiny rips along the edges and patches where the paint had blistered and flaked. It was clear that this had been a treasured piece once, something someone had cared for deeply enough to commission, but never protected. And yet, for all its evident care, it had been left to languish in obscurity, a quiet witness to a past that had long since been forgotten. The figure at the center, a young slave child, barely more than a boy, was portrayed with an intimacy that made the restorer pause. His hands were small, his fingers curled around something indistinct, and his expression was a mixture of fear, resignation, and something else they could not immediately identify. Even in the dim light of the archive, there was a texture to the painting that suggested life, as though the child might blink or shift if disturbed. The team murmured among themselves, wondering why such a piece had been overlooked, why it had been allowed to gather dust, while more flamboyant works hung in the public eye. As they carefully cleaned a small section of the surface, the faintest glimmer of something hidden began to appear in the child's grasp, but the object remained a mystery, teasing the imagination and hinting at secrets long buried beneath layers of paint and memory. The air around them felt charged, as if the portrait were aware of their presence, waiting for the moment when someone would finally see what it had been holding all along. Once the fragile canvas had been carefully transported to the main restoration table, the team set about their work with a mix of reverence and curiosity. The room, usually filled with the soft hum of fluorescent lights, felt unusually still, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The restorers worked with brushes finer than a hair, slowly removing layers of accumulated dust and decades of grimy residue, revealing colors that were richer and more vivid than they had imagined. Yet it was not until they decided to enlarge the image digitally that the true peculiarity of the portrait began to emerge. The scanner's wearing filled the room with a low, steady vibration as the image expanded on the high-resolution monitor. At first, it was simply a child, alone and solemn, the folds of his worn clothing meticulously painted, his expression guarded, yet piercing. But as the restorers zoomed in, inch by inch, a detail long hidden by the brushstrokes and years of neglect began to take shape. The object in the child's hands had been almost invisible to the naked eye, lost in the muted browns of the original paint. It was delicate, oddly symmetrical, and carved with a precision that suggested it was far more than a simple toy. Its tiny contours seemed to twist and shift in the light of the monitor, casting shadows that the original painting had never conveyed. One restorer leaned closer, eyes widening, certain the enlargement was playing tricks on them, that the object was merely a smudge or a flaw in the canvas. But as the digital image continued to grow, the form became unmistakable. A small figure, shaped like something that should not exist in the safe, orderly world of the 17th century. The room felt colder suddenly, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Each member of the team felt it, the hair on their arms rising, as if the painting itself were aware of their intrusion. The child's hands held the object firmly, yet there was no warmth or familiarity in the grip, only a sense of intent, of purpose beyond comprehension. Shadows seemed to gather around the edges of the figure, and the eyes of the child, already unnervingly sharp, appeared almost alive, reflecting the light of the screen with a glint that no mere pigment should have been able to hold. Every detail that had been invisible before now demanded attention: the minute carvings on the object, the subtle lines in the child's fingers, the way his gaze seemed to shift slightly with each movement of the image. It was as if the digital enlargement had awakened something buried within the paint, a secret that had been waiting patiently for someone to notice. As the restorers studied the enlarged image, the object in the child's hands became more than just a curious anomaly. It was something profoundly unsettling. What had once appeared as a vague shape now revealed itself in startling clarity, a tiny, carved figure, so intricately detailed it looked almost alive. Its form was humanoid but distorted, with features twisted into an expression of something between anguish and malicious glee. The surface was polished, darkened with age, and the lines etched into it suggested a craftsmanship so meticulous it could have taken years. Yet, there was something unnatural about its proportions, as if the carver had intentionally warped it to convey a hidden meaning. The child's small fingers clasped it with a determination that suggested reverence or fear, and the way the figure caught the light made it seem almost as though it were breathing, a sinister presence trapped within the old paint. A shiver passed through the room, subtle but insistent, as each restorer leaned closer to examine the image. They whispered among themselves, trying to rationalize what they saw, insisting it was merely a doll or an amulet, a harmless relic of another era. Yet no one could deny the effect it had on them, the way the enlarged image seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Shadows on the child's face deepened unnaturally, emphasizing the sharp intensity of his gaze, and the hands holding the object looked far too deliberate, too purposeful, to be the casual grasp of a painting. One of the restorers reached instinctively for the magnifying glass, studying the tiny carvings on the figure. The lines suggested eyes, a mouth, and even the faintest hints of veins or sinew, details no ordinary figurine should possess. Yet the craftsmanship was so exquisite that it seemed entirely intentional, a message frozen in time. The room's air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the painting had drawn a quiet breath in response to their attention. A cold draft whispered through the lab, though no windows were open, and the soft hum of the scanner now sounded distant and hollow. Each member of the team became aware of a subtle unease, a prickling sensation that they were being watched, though the lab had been empty moments before. Even the light from the screen seemed to bend around the object, accentuating shadows in ways that made the tiny figure appear three-dimensional, as though it might slip from the child's hands and stand before them. There was a sense that this was not simply a relic of history, not merely a carved toy or trinket, but a conduit, something that connected the child to a secret older and darker than any of them could comprehend, a secret that had been preserved in silence for centuries. At first, the strange occurrences in the lab were subtle, almost easily dismissed. A flicker of light in the corner of the room, the faint hum of machinery that had been perfectly silent moments before. But as the restorers continued their work on the portrait, the disturbances became harder to ignore. Tools would be displaced, even when no one had moved from their stations. Brushes rolled across the table as if pushed by invisible fingers, and delicate fragments of old paint flaked from the canvas without explanation. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on them in heavy waves, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made their throats dry. Even seasoned restorers, accustomed to the quirks of old materials and temperamental equipment, felt a creeping sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of their concentration. One evening, as a single restorer worked late under the harsh, white lights, the temperature in the room plummeted suddenly. Her breath misted in front of her, and the monitor displaying the enlarged portrait seemed to shimmer unnaturally, the child's eyes darkening as though in warning. She reached instinctively to adjust the screen, but it was no longer responding to her touch. Behind her, the soft scrape of something moving across the floor made her turn sharply, heart hammering, only to find the room empty, the shadows cast by the lamps stretching in impossible angles. Whispers began to echo softly, barely audible at first, like voices carried through a long, forgotten corridor. They were fragmented and disjointed, syllables that hinted at a language lost to time, yet the tone was unmistakably menacing. Other restorers began reporting similar experiences. Chairs tilted without being touched, lights flickered violently, and equipment inexplicably shut down or powered on its own. One claimed to have glimpsed a shadowy figure behind him, in the reflection of the glass covering another canvas, though when he spun around, the space was empty. More disturbing still was the collective feeling that they were being watched, a sensation so intense that even those who tried to rationalize it felt their skin crawl. It was as if the enlarged image of the child, or perhaps the object in his hands, had reached beyond the confines of the canvas and was testing the boundaries of the world around them. The psychological strain grew steadily, each restorer becoming hyper, aware of every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected draft, every flicker of light. Even the normally mundane act of examining the painting was now fraught with tension, as though one misstep might awaken the thing trapped in the image. Some began to avoid looking directly at the child's hands, the tiny figure held there, but curiosity proved stronger than fear. Every glance revealed more. The shadows in the folds of the clothing deepened. The figure's posture seemed more deliberate, and the eyes of the child almost shifted, following their movements across the lab. Silent and accusing, driven by both dread and fascination, the restorers began scouring every historical record they could find, desperate to uncover the origins of the tiny figure clutched in the child's hands. The archives yielded few answers at first, just fragments of ledgers, faded letters, and obscure references to the family that had commissioned the painting. Their initial research suggested that the child had belonged to a wealthy household in the late 1600s. Yet the more they dug, the more inconsistencies emerged. Names were misspelled, dates contradicted one another, and certain pages seemed to have been deliberately erased or tampered with. Then, hidden among a stack of yellowed papers, they found a set of instructions written in a careful, precise hand, describing a ritual meant to preserve the essence of the bound in miniature form. The language was arcane, almost poetic, and the object in the child's hands was unmistakably the very artifact described. A talisman designed to capture something beyond the ordinary, a secret meant to endure long after flesh and memory had decayed. As they pieced together the fragments, a horrifying picture began to take shape. The family had not merely sought a portrait for vanity or commemoration. They had intended the painting as a vessel, a way to contain and control whatever force the object embodied. The child chosen for his innocence and vulnerability had been an unwitting participant, the carrier of a secret far too dangerous to reveal openly. Each word in the records hinted at the ritual's power, suggesting that those who looked too closely might feel its lingering presence. The tiny figure had been crafted with painstaking care, imbued with intent, and perhaps something even darker, a force that the centuries had not entirely dissipated. The restorers began to notice the alignment between the historical records and the strange occurrences in the lab. Equipment that malfunctioned, shadows that moved independently, the sensation of being watched. All now seemed less like coincidence and more like consequence. The child in the painting, so solemn and still, had been a sentinel, his gaze following them for centuries, guarding the secret in his hands with the same unwavering intensity it had held when the paint was fresh. One researcher hesitated before leaning too close to the digital enlargement, suddenly aware that their curiosity might carry a price, that the talisman was not merely a relic, but an active presence, responsive to attention, feeding on observation and perhaps on fear itself. The revelation left them both enthralled and terrified, caught between the thrill of uncovering history and the instinctive warning that some secrets were never meant to be disturbed. The room felt charged, every shadow more defined, every whisper more insistent, as if the portrait itself had grown aware of their comprehension. The child's hands, still clasping the miniature figure, held not only the weight of history, but a menace that had endured centuries, a secret both beautiful and horrifying, a truth that demanded acknowledgement yet resisted understanding.